So, and it was phenomenal. I had no idea anything could taste like that. Now, I've heard since black currant is a very popular fruit for mead because it's just stunningly delicious because of its high acidic initial properties. So is that ancient or is that modern? How do you view black currant?
Black currant is a good addition. You know, it's a berry that appears in the historical record, although red and white currants seem to be a little bit more common in historical meads. And you have to be careful when something says currant, you need to look in context carefully and make sure they don't mean small dried raisins, what we call Zante currants, because it's not always specified clearly which type of currant is meant, and they all add very different flavors.
Well, I don't know. Michael was asking who made it, Brad or Gordon. Brad made it. Brad made it, and it was, I had told him we were at a BYO event in Asheville, North Carolina, and I asked him what commercial meads to buy, and he just shook his head, and he said, let me bring you this. So that was
I have to agree with that. Is on the whole, I do not find commercial meads on average to be, on average, I typically will prefer homebrewed mead.
Certainly, Brad seemed to imply that. So, and I'm still new at this, but I will have to say Moonlight Meaderies, and the ones I've tried for them are close to Brad's. So I think there are a few out there. I just don't know them all.
No, there are some very good commercial meads out there. Don't get me wrong. There's also a number of perfectly ordinary commercial meads.
And Joseph says you are correct. So Joseph also has a question. So did ancient mead makers have Brett or wild yeast to help them make the mead?
Almost absolutely certainly. That recipe I was talking about earlier that first appears in a 1570 herbal, one of the very early versions of that recipe calls for, let me see if I can remember, yeast of bread or of ale or sour yeast. I'm really interested in tracking that down. Now, of course, this particular version was in either Dutch or German. So there's a bunch of research there to try to figure out what in the time and context sour yeast would have meant. We also can go back to that paper that I was talking about earlier where the scientists used, now this is 2,000 to 5,000 year old yeasts that they extracted. So quite a bit earlier. But out of those 4 beers that they thought tasted okay, 4 different yeasts, 3 of them were non-Saccharomyces. We also still see in a lot of old recipes, we see wild fermentation, or rather we see no obvious or intentional addition of yeast and circumstances under which wild yeast could readily be introduced. So certainly the question of yeasts other than Saccharomyces in historical meads is, it absolutely happened. What those would have looked like and how they would have tasted is going to be really difficult to address with the changes in yeast. Although, again, we might argue that without the domestication pressure from humans using the yeasts for their own ends, you might be able to argue from a genetic standpoint that some of these wild yeasts may have varied yet. On the other hand, you could also argue, I'm here in the US, do wild yeast that float around my air have any resemblance to the wild yeast that would have been floating around in Germany or France or England 400 years ago? It's actually one of the big reasons why I essentially do no experimentation with wild yeast. I live about 10 miles outside of Boston in a relatively highly built up suburb. I'm not sure I want to be brewing with what's floating around in my air.
Well, Laura, that begs the question, though. Now, what little bit I know about historical brewing is probably limited to what a few people have told me. But for beer, you know, a couple of centuries ago, it was brewed by the housewife, and she had an ale stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of
Mm-hmm.
course, they didn't know what yeast was, so the stories I've heard is she'd take the same stick, and you know, they just knew that made it work.
But let's be a little bit more precise about it. They did not know that this microorganism that we call Saccharomyces cerevisiae was a metabolic agent turning sugar to alcohol. They knew. We see 700-year-old, this 1350 recipe I was telling you about, the German one, calls for adding a nut, which we interpreted it as, you know, basically a nutshell full of yeast. They had things that they called yeast. They didn't know what it was biologically, but they knew that it was an agent that made it do what they wanted.
So
you know, the yeast stick would have had yeast on it.
right.
That would have introduced a reliable culture every time. You stir that stick in, the yeast adheres to it, you pull it out, it dries. When you put it back in, yes, there will have been some other things floating through the air that may have adhered to it, but they're vastly outnumbered and outcompeted by the yeast that were already there from your previous batch. Relatively speaking, that's a highly controlled process. It's not random. You know exactly what you're introducing on that yeast stick. And it is the same as you used for your last 10, 12, whatever batches.
So I mean, that's what I wanted to ask with Joseph's question. He was implying, you know, did they have Brett? And my question was it not more like lambic, and it was wild fermented?
I think that probably both things were happening. Okay. That there was wild fermentation, and that may have been. Now, remember, again, yeast is fairly pervasive in the environment. If you're in your house or your yard where you cook bread every day, and you make bread and you make beer once a month, if you've just finished making bread a few hours ago, what is most likely to be floating around in your air?
Lots of yeast. And probably on their hands, because I don't know.
Yes, again. So some of the uncertainty here is not as high as you might think when you say, I opened it up and I let whatever came down out of the air land on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and of course these are wonderful intellectual exercises, because you can postulate 60, and this is one of the things that I find utterly wonderful about working a modern version out of these recipes, is first thing you do is you look and you figure out what all the words mean, which isn't necessarily always easy. And then the first thing is this explosion of what are all the possible things they could be talking about. And then you start narrowing it back down and saying, well, this seems most likely, or, well, they say make it in September, so spring, you know, they say make it in September, so I'm going to use a fall honey, not a spring honey. Mm-hmm. They say, and then you start narrowing it back down to what you think is representative. But that representative can always be interpreted in different ways. One of the things that I talk about in my book is this, that's coming out hopefully really soon, is this boil it for 2 hours. Well, how much liquid do you lose in 2 hours? It depends on how strong your fire is, how shallow or deep your pot is, how strongly do you stir it. If you stir it a lot, you're going to get more evaporation. So you can argue that if it's at a low simmer and you just let it sit there, maybe you'll only lose 10% of the volume in 2 hours. You could also argue that if it's an aggressive boil and a big, wide, shallow pan, you could lose as much as 40%. Well, isn't that going to make a huge difference in your gravity? So where I set up, and I typically assume a constant 15% per hour liquid loss, which is in keeping with most beer brewing and other guidelines, and also with the recipes that give me data on time and liquid loss. There's a few of them. But you could argue that to 8 or 10%, or you could argue it to 20%, and that makes uncertainty. So I love this argument about what does it mean?
My wife doesn't call it that. So Joseph says, thank you. I have a Brett, and I think that's lacto yeast.
Yeah, lacto yeast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And this layering of yeasts probably also happened. We see you boil it, you cool it, and that cooling is sometime in another container. You ferment it, sometimes open, sometimes closed, and then you often age it in another container. So by the time this recipe gets to where it's being drunk, it could have gone through 3 or 4 different containers. And certainly you can make an argument, and it would be a perfectly valid, plausible interpretation, that I'm going to model something that I boiled it, then I aged it then I did the fermentation in a barrel where wine had been, which is not uncommon request. And then you rack it out into another barrel for aging. Oh, well, for my interpretation, I'm going to assume that that barrel had been infected with some Brett. So I'm going to make a historical secondary Brett fermentation.
Yep.
You're laughing, but it's plausible.
Sure.
I'm not saying it's certainly not the highest likelihood interpretation you could make, but it's a very easy, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That could happen. That could happen. So this is the joy of, and this is why I think historical recipes can be interesting to anyone, is because they can look at these ingredients, they can look at these methodologies, and they can look at this equipment and they can say, oh, look, here's something that I can pull to inspire and inform what I'm doing. And it gives me a connection back to this past, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is, Joseph, you'll have to let Laura know how your mead turns out. That sounds like Brett and lacto could be an interesting combination.
Yeah, I certainly, I don't think that those alternate yeasts have filtered their way into the mead making community nearly to the extent they're currently popular in beer making. And
would you expect it to be good? I mean, because it's going to certainly add some sour and funk to it.
I think to a certain extent, I think sour and funk with honey is a really, I mean, how often do we add things to the honey that are meant to counteract that sweetness?
Yeah.
And here we're adding just a different methodology to balance those flavors and provide something that is a different aspect.
Well, Joseph, thank you. We've got one more question from Gary. If anybody else has got any more questions, now's the time to pop them in. Otherwise, I think we will wrap up in just a minute. So Gary asks, when does the traditional high honey to water ratio Polish styles begin appearing in the historical record? Now, you just came back from Poland, didn't you?
Actually, I wasn't in Poland. I was in, I've got to get it right. Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. See, now that I've been there, I can actually get them right. And I saw lots and lots of honey, and I didn't have much time to try to track down mead, but I did not succeed in tracking down any mead, which is okay. I was pretty busy.
It sounds like it.
So
what do you think of his question? Would you like me to read it again?
No, it's actually a really good question, and one that I really want to delve into further. The information that I've gathered to date doesn't have anything that's clearly indicative of those high gravity We see some high gravity meads, we see long aging meads, but we don't see that link to that Eastern Poland area with those same high gravities. We see references to some meads that are being made in Moscow and eastern parts, which are very long aging, but these are travelogues and their specifics are lacking in terms of trying to figure out what's actually going there. So we keep hearing that those Polish high gravity meads, the Dwoźniak and the Troźniak, which I'm probably mangling the pronunciation, are of quite old pedigree. I've had trouble in the few passes I've given at it, really finding solid information on the historical pedigree of them. As in, when people say old with mead, I've had people say, oh, this is an ancient recipe, it's 100 years old. And well, in that case, their definition isn't matching mine. So I believe there's this tradition is very old, but whether that's 200 years, 400 years, 800 years old, I haven't been able to track down yet. And I'm really hoping I've found some references and I have accessed some 16th century Polish texts. And I have a partial translation of at least one of them, courtesy of someone I met on the internet. See what that internet does for us. Well, it's truly amazing. When I first started doing this many, many years ago, I literally went through 20 volumes of index of the early English books, paper index, page by page, looking for a thing, and then went to the 400 reels of microfilm.
I remember those.
Print. And when I got back to this quite a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now, it has now become ticky, download from Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, that's Germany. Ticky, download from Bibliothèque Nationale Française. Ticky, you can see. And I have done some visits, and it's amazing to go into the British Library, request, and then a couple hours later, here is this 400, 500-year-old text in front of you. And looking through it, and there's recipes for mead.
So back to Gary's question.
Anyway, so the answer is
appearing. When do you think that is? Can you speculate a century?
My speculation is that it is more likely than not that those Polish traditions do go back at least 300 or 400 years. The clues, the bits and pieces I've been able to find so far leave me fairly optimistic that that tradition is probably that old. But I cannot say with certainty at this point in time. How's that for
very succinct? Until I got you off topic.
Yeah.
And Michael says this has been an outstanding session. Thank you, Laura, for very informative chat. Good evening, all. So I think he's...
What I want to say to anyone is, if you go to my website, you'll find an email. I love talking with people. I love questions, and I also love hearing about what people are doing, like listening to the little discussion we had on the Brett and lacto, and just, well, there's another possibility.
We'll have to do another webinar.
Well, there you go.
It sounds like a lot of fun. Now, William has a great question, and William, this is particularly apropos, but I'll ask the question, and let me make a quick comment before you jump into your answer. It'll give you a chance to think. So William asks, what do you think about recreating historical meads using Patrick McGovern's pollen analysis from grapevines? Now, the comment I wanted to make, William, is Patrick and I are talking about doing a webinar. So
I've heard he's a wonderful speaker. I have not seen him speak, but I've heard very good things about him.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. And one of the things he wants to know is what we would like to discuss. And I thought, wow, that's a big topic. So William, sounds like you'd like to talk about his pollen analysis. But if anybody's got input, that would be great. And before you answer, Henry's saying excellent session. James is saying really enjoyed. Dan is saying fascinating webinar. Thank you, Laura. So everybody's really appreciating. So William, we'll get back to your question. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you. So I as a scientist, I really love the use of fancy modern extraction and machines with all the bells and whistles telling us about what happened 2, 4, and 9. You know, if you're going back to the China, the Jiahu finds 9,000 years ago. I think it's just fascinating, and
it boggles the mind, doesn't it?
It boggles the mind, and you know, the way we're using that technology. You know, now that we've seen those using the yeast being extracted and revived and being used, it's just it's wonderful stuff. And you need to be careful when you're doing something like that, because you need to be aware at all times that it's another step removed from instructions, because all you're getting from that is an ingredient list. And even with pollen analysis, there's always some uncertainty. You know, was the pollen in the honey, or was the pollen from the addition of some other thing else as a flavoring? They've seen this, a lot of those finds use mead sweet or meadow sweet, which, by the way, again, a flower that's fairly easily findable, mead sweet, Filipendula, Omeria, wonderful flavor. I made a mead with the meadow sweet flowers, just the meadow sweet flowers, and I really loved it.
So do you know, I mean, I know what Patrick is doing with analysis of the contents.
Yeah.
I'm unaware of what he's doing with pollen analysis from grave finds and how that could be associated with historical beverages or meads. And
so essentially what they're doing is what they're finding, and grave sites are good because they tend to be less muddy. You know, a good example is the Hochtorf cauldron, where there's this large cauldron that was buried in a high level burial. And at the bottom, after this is, you know, they put him in, bury him with the drink in the cauldron, and it sits there for hundreds of years. The water all evaporates and it leaves a residue at the bottom. Because the grave is left and it's a chamber, you don't have dirt piling on top of it. It's relatively undisturbed. So when you come in, open that up as an archaeological dig, you actually have something in there which is relatively undisturbed. You know, you think of an archaeological dig, you think of all the dirt.
Yeah.
These graves, often what's the contents of those clay vessels, or in some cases, clay vessels, were protected. So they take that and they extract what's left in the little pores of the clay. And that's the pollen analysis and the HPLC and the GCMS that tries to establish through scientific analysis exactly what those residues represent.
Okay.
And at the end, what you get by looking at that and being smart and knowing that this little grain of pollen looks like this because it's that flower. I have to admit the concept of looking at a sample and counting and identifying each of the hundreds and hundreds of pollen grains. I love jigsaw puzzles. I hate the idea because I have no idea what different pollens look like. I suspect that if I actually knew what the different pollens look like and thought I could do it, it would probably be pretty soon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, this is fine, Zen. But even saying that's pollen, okay, I'll take your word for it, that's pollen. So to me, it's like this mystery. So then they end up with a list. Well, a list, and then he had partnered with Dogfish Head Brewing, and they produced a number of these drinks. I've actually had a few of them, and they're quite interesting. But that going from a list of ingredients to a recipe does involve a huge amount of speculation. Even more so than I go through in my recipes. And then when they added the layer of making something that they were producing on a commercial scale and selling and presumably made at least some profit off of, also, I think, to a certain extent, constrained their choices.
Yeah. Well, they wanted to make something commercial. So,
Yeah. So every time they do it, they're digressing, but probably digressing just a little bit more from pure historical accuracy. But that's not again, I need to stress, that's not a negative. This historical accuracy is a complete continuum. It's not like there's any natural stopping point along the way. I do things when I'm making my meads that would make a historical purist snark. They would say, what makes you think that that's historical brewing? But I recognize that and I admit it, and I'm not going to make any big deal about it. But this is also why I think that this historical brewing is so interesting, because you can do it anyway from, I'm going to, I have a swarm that I caught from the wild. I put them in a hollow log. I'm going to harvest this honey next spring, crush the combs into my iron kettle over my fire, and put it into the barrel that I made from oak that I harvested myself. There are people out there, that's what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They are probably the closest, or as close as you can get to absolute historical purity. And another 10 years from now, as we learn more in this whole field of what they call experimental archaeology, or XArch, has become much more respectable in the last 10 years and 10, 20 years, and is becoming really recognized as a way for us to learn things. Because when you try to do something and it simply doesn't work, you learn a huge amount about how they very well. A good friend of mine, we look at it and we say, well, they didn't know what yeast was. They didn't know what yeast nutrients were. They couldn't sterilize things properly. We tend to look down our nose at them and say, well, they were smart. They were as smart as we are. And they had huge amounts of experience of making the best they could with what they had. And as a result, they were incredibly ingenious and incredibly effective in getting things done. And we should never lose track of that, because that's history, I'm speaking, and that history is interesting because it echoes to the current day. As I said, all of these mead makers, they are doing something that has been done. We know this has been done for at least 9,000 years. Honey being used to make a drink that people drink and enjoy. And now we're doing it. And we're making that drink in a myriad of different ways that we enjoy and we love.
Well, while you've got it up there, cheers.
Cheers.
Well, I think that is just about the end of our questions. I wanted to ask one that was in the chat and you didn't touch on it. Well, they were talking about caramelizing the honey. So before we wrap up, we're getting into, I guess that's Beauches. And
Beauches.
Can you talk about that just briefly, and then we will wrap up?
I've taken to calling the Beauche recipe, the 1393 French recipe, the recipe that launched 1,000 meads. And that is not a joke in more ways than once. As Helen of Troy was taken to be a singular beauty, among the 2,500 recipes I've cataloged, that recipe is singular. There are no other recipes in my catalog that use caramelized honey as the sugar source. There's one other recipe that's repeated in a couple of different texts that uses caramelized honey to provide color to a mead. It adds tablespoons of caramelized honey to a gallon of mead with the stated intention to add color. So Beauche is fascinating because it's this one singular recipe, and yet look at how many, it's like almost an entire BJCP category all by itself, I think, to hear how many people talk about it and how hard you caramelize the honey. What do you add? And the funny thing is, when you make it as the recipe calls for, it's only got an OG of about 1.05, 1.054.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very mild. ferments, obviously it ferments dry like that. And even with the spices in it, it's not a big mead.
So while it may be popular now, it has very little historical precedent.
Oh, it has an extraordinarily solid singular historical precedent.
Singular.
The evidence would suggest that it was not common historically.
Yeah, it was a one-off.
It is absolutely historical.
Yes.
And certainly it's just amazing how it's caught the imagination of people and been turned into this diverse breadth of different things. It's really fantastic.
I can see your enthusiasm when you say that. And I want to share this. Gary Fuller says, thanks as always. And Laura's fantastic, just as good as her HomebrewCon presentation, except it was missing her meads. Yes.
Well, when I come to Colorado, I'm going to have to try to figure how to get some samples out to Colorado from Massachusetts.
Well, good. Laura, did you have a closing comment for all of us that are interested in recreating ancient meads? And some of them, like me, I've never brewed a mead before. How would you inspire us on these ancient ingredients?
Try something new. To me, mead making, the joy that I find in mead making is the art of it, which I'm an engineer, I'm a scientist. Wait, where did that come from? I guess I'm being atypical here. Look at the recipes. Find an ingredient that looks interesting, a flavor, because there are flavors in there, some of them very easily found, but you may not have thought of. I would not recommend the horseradish mead I made. Technically, it was fine. The flavor was just odd. I'm sure there's someone out there who will think it's the best thing since sliced bread, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to make that one again. So, enjoy, experiment. Look.
Yeah, I want to try and find some. Was it long pepper? That sounds
long
bad.
pepper. Yeah,
long
it's
pepper.
Mead is the story of history. Mead is in the interconnectivity of all things. It all connects to one another, and it's part of life.
Well, Laura, thank you for spending time with us today. This has been awesome. And I thank you for this great audience that we've had. We've had lots of good chat, lots of great questions. These are always a lot of fun. And I appreciate the opportunity to get to do these. And again, I'm trying to encourage AHA to do more of these. And right now, the only way I know to vote is to join or renew your AHA membership, or send somebody an email. And I can give you some email addresses too. The webinar will be recorded and sent along with everything else that we mentioned. Laura, but you may have some contact information. You shared your website. Do you want to share an email address there?
Oh, well, here, you might guess, Mystery of Mead at Gmail. Surprise.
There we go. I see it right there. And before we wrap up, you said you've got a book. Do you want to talk about that just briefly?
So I am working on what I hope is the final set of edits on. No, I do not have a typo in the first word of my title. That is the Wellcome Library, which is in London, England. And it's got 105 named recipes with 134 variant recipes, all taken from 17th and 18th century English manuscripts. They've got over 100 different flavor additions. I talk about things like yeast and honey and water and how to approach historical recipes, and tried really to give something that's insight into the time and helps people think about all the ways they can include history in their mead making. As I say, whether they are focused on the history or whether they are completely modern in every tool and technique they use, but just looking for something they might add or something different. Or
well, it looks very finished, but it's not available quite yet.
It is not quite available yet. I am awaiting comments in the next couple of weeks from my external reviewers, who I am hoping will say, yeah, this is good to go. And if they don't, then it's going to be a while longer, because I want to make it as good as it can be.
So if somebody wants to get on your mailing list to know when it's available,
yeah, I will be posting to my website, and it's going to be printed through Amazon, so it'll be available as a print on demand, and then as a Kindle book sometime.
Well, awesome.
Shortly after that.
Well, you have to tell me when it's available, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk again.
And then I can start working on the next book, which is going to be probably 60 or 70 of the earliest mead recipes, all from before 1600.
Well, I've learned a lot. Thank you so much, Laura. This was a great show tonight, and I appreciate the great audience. So everybody have a wonderful evening if you're in the United States. And for those of you in other parts of the world, it might be the wee parts of the morning, early parts of the morning. So,
yes, I was deeply impressed. I saw Okinawa in Germany, and Washington State, and Arizona, and Ohio. So I'm really impressed.
You know how to draw a crowd. So everybody have a great day, or a great next day, as the case may be. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you all for listening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.